Okay, brothers and sisters, welcome back to another edition of The Last Dispensation. I am your host, Troy, and I have also with me my co-host, he hosts his own program, but he co-hosts with me once in a while, Jared from Christian Homestead. And we have a very special guest with us today, Hannah Stoddard. She is with it's not the Joseph Smith Foundation, right? It's Joseph Smith Foundation.
Yeah, Joseph Smith
Okay.
Foundation.
All right. And we have an interesting, I don't know where this is going to go. This is the book Behind Closed Doors. And you can see I marked it up since I last talked to you. My wife and I stayed up till about 1 o'clock in the morning reading this, and we're not done, but we're going to keep reading, which is interesting because she was just called to the Relief Society presidency. And I just feel like I really felt the Holy Ghost when we were reading it last night. But anyway, let me start by reading your bio, and I hope it's still up to date here. Hold on just a second here. Okay, now it's saying I don't have it. Let me see here. Here we go. L. Hannah Stoddard is the lead author of Faith Crisis, Volume 1, We Are Not Betrayed, Seerstone versus Urim and Thummim, Book of Mormon translation on trial, and Faith Crisis, the one that we're talking about today, Volume 2, right? New Mormon History Exiled from Church Headquarters.
Oh, that might be might be an old bio. That was the original title. That was the
okay.
When it was
but
released.
It's called Behind Closed Doors right now.
Yeah.
Let's see here. She's the executive director of the Joseph Smith Foundation and producer director of 7 documentary feature films, Nephites in Europe, Hidden Bloodlines, The Grail and the Lost Tribes in the Lands of the North, Unlocking the Mystery of the Two Prophets, which talks about the book of Revelation, chapter 11, the prophet Joseph Smith, More Than We Know, what's this, Statesmen and Symbols?
Yeah, that goes into just Joseph Smith and Freemasonry, answering all those faith crisis questions and temple symbolism.
And then For Our Day, Divinely Sanctioned Governments. You have a lot of books and different things on your website, and I'm going to leave the link. And then there's For Our Day, Covenant on the Land.
That was the first one that I helped produce. So
okay. In addition to directing Joseph Smith Foundation projects for over a decade, she is often invited to speak on various radio and video programs. Hannah helped direct her first documentary film beginning at age 16. Wow, that's incredible.
Pretty early.
Yeah.
I had an adventurous childhood for sure.
Definitely. You had 10 brothers and sisters?
Yes. So I am the oldest of 10, 9 living. So my father, we did home education, but my dad was actually a public school teacher before he couldn't afford to raise that large of a family on a school salary.
Right.
And so he was always out of the box thinker. He ended up going into engineering and then video production. And so he always thought, he said, why do we waste so much time filling out these worksheets that we're just going to throw away? The kids don't care. The parents don't care. The teachers don't care. So he said, what if we make everything project oriented? So he said, if we're studying history, we're going to write a book, or we're going to do a documentary. We're going to learn how to do research, go figure out how to do the difference between primary sources and secondary sources. And if we're going to write, let's publish it online and learn how to do professional work just right out the get-go. Why wait? And I think it took a lot of patience trying to do that with teenagers.
Right.
But it was definitely life-changing because it made the gospel so real and it made it applicable. And it also taught us that we could do something and that we didn't just need to wait. Like, one day I'm going to do something to make a difference in the world. It's like, well, right now I have a testimony of the gospel. I have access to truth. How do I help other people find it? So.
Right. Okay.
How did you get
So-
involved with Joseph Smith Foundation? How is that like a family thing, or how did that start?
So my dad founded it, technically all the way back in 2005, but it went through a bunch of different names. At first it was Zion Vision. And then we were toying with like Zion Vision and wanted to start a curriculum, website called Brigham Young Academy. And then we went into like Joseph Smith Forum, Joseph Smith Academy, and it ended up at the Joseph Smith Foundation. And so that has been kind of the name that we ended up with.
That's so cool. So let me go on here just real quick. You've also worked as a history and literature teacher, graphic design artist, software developer, videographer, project manager, agriculturalist. And what is an agriculturalist? Just somebody that studies agriculture?
Right. Yes. So especially with so we have 11.5 acres.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
A
right.
homestead. And so it has like a vineyard, and we're experimenting with different gardening techniques, everything from permaculture to different kinds of greenhouses and things like that. So
That's cool. Okay, so we're almost done here. Research assistant. Her work focuses on church history, doctrine, answers to Latter-day Saint faith crisis questions, educational philosophy, culture, and defending the prophet Joseph Smith. Hannah's research supports the writings and teachings of ancient and latter-day prophets. I totally agree with all of that. It's amazing. So without further ado, let's dive right into this. Now, I want to bring something up real quick. Can I screen share with you guys?
Yeah.
Just briefly before we get into this. I'm kind of, let me see here. Rusty at this a little bit. I just wanted to show there's 3 books in this series, right?
yes, well, technically there's Faith Crisis 1 and then Faith Crisis 2. And then a lot of people lump the Seer Stone v. Urim and Thummim book into it. Technically it's not a volume in the series, but a lot of people just blend it in there.
Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, and then they can get this for how much right now?
Yeah, so you can get it on our website, and the retail basic is 20, but then it goes down with like different bundle prices. But then there's Kindles. We have 1 audiobook online and 2 other audiobooks that are going to be coming out very soon. So
Okay.
different versions. Those are on Amazon, and you can get ebooks on Barnes and Noble and wherever you want. So.
All right, cool. All right. Okay, so the book is Behind Closed Doors. I've been reading it. It's about a lot of different things. It gets pretty involved. You did tell me that yesterday because I texted you and I said I haven't finished yet. And then you told me, get into the meat of it. And you gave me the chapters. And I did. Spencer W. Kimball once said that he likes to get into the meat of a book.
Right.
And later so I got into the middle chapters that you told me to get into, and then I read the last chapter with my wife, and we were astounded, amazed, and filling the spirit, but at the same time concerned about things going on. And so, and then later on, I'll just get the sides. This was the meat. I'll do the sides later. Okay, so Hannah, where should we begin with this?
Right.
Go ahead.
Okay, well, I guess for those probably that are listening to this and wondering what on earth are they talking about, I don't even know what this is about.
I don't know what I'm talking about.
So the premise of the 2 volumes of Faith Crisis is that right now there is a movement that is both coordinated and to some degree organized and and very, very passionate to revise our Latter-day Saint church history towards a progressive direction. So a lot of people have recognized this happening in general American history, just history and worldwide history, right? We saw this with this was happening in the 1800s with the founding of America, really. The Pilgrims and the Puritans. You had books like The Scarlet Letter, textbooks that were being changed to denigrate the founding fathers and the founding mothers of America. In the 1900s, you had Charles and Mary Beard, who really started pushing this idea where they said, you know, we've had this narrative that the founding fathers of America were God-fearing, and they, you know, they sacrificed their lives and their fortunes and their sacred honor for liberty and you know, just this faith-inspiring narrative. And they were like, let's be honest. No one does that without some motivation, and everything in this world is driven by money. This was really a Marxist philosophy of looking at history. So they said, well, no one does anything without financial incentive. What was the financial motivation of the revolution? And so they actually wrote books and pushed this narrative to rewrite our American history from the perspective that it was all economically motivated. And that is really where we get the whole idea, where you ask people today, oh, what was behind the American Revolution? And they all say, oh, it was taxation without representation. Well, if you actually study the founding fathers and you actually read the original documents, yeah, taxation without representation is listed in the Declaration of Independence, but it's reason number 17 on a whole list of other things involving judicial activism, religious freedom. The King of England was coming in and trying to stop the publication of the Bible in America, missionary work among the Indians. That was really what was at the forefront of the founding fathers' minds. It was not so much about taxes. That was a issue. It wasn't the issue. But
so would you say, just real quick, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Would you say in the 20th century, because I know I remember reading in the book that you talk about the revisionist history that started like after the 1920s.
Right.
Yes. So would you say that older narrative was taught in the 19th century and then changed to kind of flip to taxation and different things besides, you know, when it used to be religious freedom and other more noble causes?
So wait, at this point, you're referring to revisionist history of the United States, not the church yet. Okay.
Right. Yes. I'm just gonna like laying the groundwork that there's this whole environment of really revising the history, right? And yeah, so in the 1900s for sure, the seeds for it are being laid in the 1800s, right? Because you have Charles Darwin publishing on the origin of species. You have Karl Marx pushing obviously a Marxian ideas. You have changes in economics with John Keynes. You've got Sigmund Freud. You have all of these philosophers that rise up the same time as Joseph Smith, which is not a surprise, right? Because Joseph Smith himself said, every time God sets up his kingdom, the devil's like right there following right along, right? Mm-hmm. So you have this growing secularism, and it gets into the universities, and then you have the pioneers out here in Utah, and they obviously were driven from their homes. They're trying to build a better life for their children, and education was very important to the early Latter-day Saints. It was very important to Brigham Young. That's why they're setting up the academies, and so a lot of parents, they were like, we're going to give our children the benefit of the education that we never got. And so some of them, a lot of them sent their children into the universities, and you have people like Leonard Arrington and other scholars, they get academically or really trained in secularism. Then they come back home and they're like, wait a minute, basically this new worldview. Now, how do I blend that with the church? And especially in the mid 1900s, you had groups like the Swearing Elders or different scholars that didn't feel like they felt like, well, I don't think I can accept maybe that the Book of Mormon historically occurred. I can't accept that there really was an Adam and Eve. So far as one of Leonard Arrington's friends could not even accept that Jesus Christ was divine. They're members of the church, but they're struggling to blend their more secular and progressive worldview with the church. And so there was a movement specifically in the history area that was led by Leonard Arrington to say, how do we rewrite? And in their minds, they're saying, well, this is the real history of church history. This idea of let me step back just a little bit. So Leonard Arrington made a statement where he was talking about the first vision. Who was Leonard Arrington?
Leonard? Let's
right.
Who is Leonard Arrington?
Right.
And sorry, and when is this happening with Leonard Arrington?
Yes. So this is going to be 1972 to about 1982. He was the church historian of up at church headquarters, Salt Lake City, Utah. And before that, yes. So this is a biography that was written by Greg Prince, who is himself a progressive historian, kind of celebrating Leonard Arrington's achievement. So Leonard Arrington is significant. He's known as the father of New Mormon history. He was probably the primary advocate and voice, and really the mover and shaker of organizing together scholars and historians and authors to change the narrative of our church history, change how we see Joseph Smith, change how we interpret the past towards a similar revisionist process that was taken in American history. So that's kind of why I laid that groundwork with understanding what was going on with American history. The same thing is happening within the church. And a lot of people don't realize that. A lot of people say, oh, yes, well, I know about what happened with American history. We can see it daily if you go start looking through the textbooks or talk to your children or see what's being taught in the government schools. But a lot of people don't realize the same type of a movement was and is happening within the church by members of the church to change the narrative of church history. So Leonard Arrington is really the father of this movement.
So he was a church historian between what was it?
Yeah, about
the late 60s or
1972
early 70s?
to 1982.
Okay.
And so he was there, and the reason why his work there ended is there was huge friction between him and several of the general authorities, and then eventually his department was completely shut down. They completely shut down the historian department up there, and Leonard Arrington kept detailed journals. So this is where we get to our book, Faith Crisis 2 Behind Closed Doors. So Leonard Arrington kept detailed journals documenting what he was trying to do, who were the players involved, what were the conversations, just basically his story doing this. And he wrote it intentionally. He wrote his journals intentionally with the view of, one day I want these to be published. One day I want people to know what I did, what the men I worked with did, because in his view, he was moving the church in a better direction, right? He's like, okay, this church we have now is not really true. It's not a good foundation. The history isn't accurate. So we're going to adopt the church to fit more within the mold of his worldview, which was more progressive. He was definitely more politically liberal. He was a full advocate of Darwinian evolution. In his view, he was like, Charles Darwin, Joseph Smith, they're about the same in terms of their contributions and ideas, and the scriptures are not completely accurate. You can't trust them. So it's just a completely different view than take someone like a Joseph Fielding Smith or an Ezra Taft Benson, coming from a completely different viewpoint. And that's where it was Ezra Taft Benson, who was a member of the Quorum of the 12 at the time when Leonard Arrington was the church historian. And that's where those two went head to head. And both of them firmly believing they were on God's side. Both of them firmly believing, were defending the church from their viewpoint.
Well, they were contemporaries, right? So
Yes.
both were from Idaho. Both
Mhm.
came from a big family. One went on a mission, one didn't.
Right.
Both
Agricultural background,
agriculture
both of them.
background. Yes.
Mhm.
So Hannah, one thing that I talk about a lot on my channel is the root cause of people's motivations, because sometimes we talk about secret combinations, but really when you scale it down, I think a lot of it comes down to, and I don't know this man at all. I haven't researched him, so I'm just going off of what you're saying, and sounds right.
Absolutely.
You have basically a spectrum of what I would call toxicity. Psychology would call it narcissism, psychopathy down on this side, more empathetic people. And when you go further down the spectrum toward toxic, these people they have different motivations. Okay. They're looking for influence, they're looking for attention, glory, power, things like that. So I've noted time and time again that there's many times where people will do things not because they actually believe it, like they're not like really so concerned about the truth as they are achieving their objectives. So you say that and I guess no one knows except for him and the Lord what his true motivations are, but is there anything to indicate that he was working with other people, that he enjoyed? Because you were talking about how he wanted his stuff to be seen almost like in a grandiose way. And so I wonder, in your research of him, is there anything to indicate that he was mostly just doing it for reasons other than the truth? Or was he being influenced by other people? Or was he receiving some kind of benefit from what he was doing?
That's a really good question. So from what we can gather just out of Leonard Arrington's own words, I believe he definitely believed that he was on the Lord's side. However you define the Lord, like his understanding of God would have been very different from a Joseph Fielding Smith's understanding of who God was. But from Leonard Arrington's understanding of who he believed God was, I believe he sincerely believed, I am benefiting the church. And he would say that. And he had different epiphany experiences. He called them epiphanies, that were essentially where he felt that God was calling him to tell the history of the church, and that he was going to, that this revisionist work was actually God's will. And so especially even when he, we have a quote on this, and I think it's in the first chapter even of Faith Crisis 2, when he's having all of this friction with the different leaders of the church. He said he just could hear a voice that was saying, I've chosen you to tell the history of my church. Keep going, stand true against the opposition. At the same time, there definitely was this sense, and there were conversations about this being debated. I believe there was a meeting, we talked about this in Faith Crisis 2 with, I believe it was Brewster McConkie who was there, if I'm remembering correctly, and Elder McConkie was saying, I don't really care if our history books that we're writing, that our historians, whether they're accepted by Stanford and Harvard, and whether the world thinks they're the greatest thing, right? Because that was one of the things Leonard Arrington was arguing. He was saying, guys, the way you're writing history right now, the world can't accept that. The secularists don't like it. They don't want to hear, oh, God was involved in this miracle and God was involved in that. That's not accepted. And some people like President Benson and McConkie were like, we don't care. We don't care about being accepted. So there's definitely that too, whether that's a thing of, I'm going to sacrifice the truth to be accepted, or whether they actually saw that is the truth, the more secularist viewpoint. I think that could be debated.
And I think that is a grandiose thing, because as I've read the things, different things about him in the book, he wasn't very pious himself, yet he wanted, but when it came to him receiving his own revelation about, or his own mission and destiny of the church, then he did believe in God. You know what I mean?
Yes.
But he was undermining the brethren, basically.
Well,
and
yeah.
didn't believe in that he called them Holy Ghosters, right?
Right. Yes. Yes. He called
Can I
her
read
like,
something real quick, just real quick from your book?
absolutely. Mhm.
This is page 145. What chapter is this? Was it 11? I think it might be chapter 11. He says, the church of the future will be grateful for what we do. Arrington prophesied on November 2nd, 1976. Prophesied, I like that. We must do it even by fighting the bureaucracy. So he's calling the church a bureaucracy, the brethren.
Hmm.
And we must expect to lose many of our fights with officialdom and expect heavy criticism. But in the interest of the church, in the interest of the Lord, we should persevere. And then he goes on, some of the
Let me
brethren
stop you right there.
go ahead.
Really don't like that, because essentially he feels that okay, what I get from that is that he feels that he has like a special calling from the Lord to correct things, and that's a fundamental failure of the understanding of prophets and apostles in their divine calling. Because who knows if he was toxic or where he was on the spectrum. There's also kind of a middle group that's kind of like, and this is psychology and spiritualism according to Jared Davies. I'm not saying that this is necessarily completely accurate, but that's the way that I view things. Then you have a middle group that they're kind of like spineless. They in other words, they kind of go according to what the prevailing atmosphere is. So they're not like very strongly convicted towards the truth, or they're not actively trying to manipulate things. They're just kind of like in the middle, and whatever the prevailing environment is, they kind of conform to whatever it is. So for him, being a secularist, being an academic, there's this desire, maybe not a nefarious desire, or maybe to conform to the rest of academia, right? Because he's concerned about how the rest of academia would view church history, and it's like, oh well, this is a problem. So he was afraid of that, it would seem. But then on top of that, he believes that he has a special calling to correct things, which is very odd because I mean, again, it goes against what our church is about, the benefit of having prophets and apostles and the scriptures. That's the primary source of our information and authority. And it just, I don't know. I'm not liking this at all. What's going on with this guy?
I think what you're hitting at is the fundamental thing is this difference in worldview, right? Because like what you just expressed, that's one way of looking at it, right? Leonard Arrington's going to be like, well, I don't look at the scriptures as the authority that you do. No, I side with you personally, but right. So, but I think what you're hitting at is because and this is why we go into this in Faith Crisis 1 and a little bit in Faith Crisis 2, like Leonard Arrington's background, right? He grows up in a relatively, average kind of Latter-day Saint home. He read the Bible and the Book of Mormon once through when he was 13, and he never read either of them all the way through again the rest of his life. So he would like pick out maybe a little bit of the Book of Mormon. And he was very proud, actually. He was like, when I give sacrament meeting talks, I do it on secular subjects. I don't do it on gospel topics. He's like, I'm not a scriptorian. That's not my expertise. He said, I enjoy going out in nature more than I go to the temple. I don't really see a ton of value in the ordinances in the temple, right? So this is his perspective. He goes, he graduated during the Great Depression, and his father said, I will pay for your mission, which was a huge financial sacrifice. And he said, I'm not going on a mission. I'm going to college. So he doesn't go on a mission. He goes to college, and in college, he has Faith Crisis. First semester, he's hitting Darwinian evolution. And interestingly, it was actually the institute director there that very discreetly helped he was progressive himself. George S. Tanner kind of moved him over and was like, well, here's another way of looking at the New Testament. Like, what if the gospel writers weren't accurately writing down? What if Matthew wasn't actually, the book of Matthew wasn't actually written by Matthew? What if it's not really what Jesus said? Like this whole idea of biblical criticism and challenging the scripture. So
And
Leonard
even the
Arrington,
documentary hypothesis is another one. Yeah.
right? Yes. So we go all into the documentary hypothesis in volume 1 because that was a big thing. Leonard Arrington was
interesting.
really big on. So it's this fundamental view of you can't trust the scriptures. It's even, and this has, people don't realize this ideology is vastly gaining traction, especially at our universities, among our young people. The idea that the Book of Mormon is biased history. Maybe it's not completely historically accurate. We had two very prominent, I'll name them, Terrell and Fiona Givens, were doing a fireside for a stake in England. They're big authors. I consider them more progressive leaning. They probably consider themselves more moderate. Anyways, I've heard debate on that, but they said on there that Mormon, the one who compiled the Book of Mormon, was a biased war general who was committing war genocide against the Lamanites and had to dehumanize. This is their own words. I'm not putting words in their mouth. The clip is out there online on YouTube. And he had to dehumanize the Lamanites as a people to justify the genocide that he was leading out as a Nephite war general. And so then he writes the Book of Mormon. So they're like, so you got to look at the Book of Mormon from that perspective. It's not completely accurate history, right? It's Mormon's biased perspective. And so then from a traditionalist perspective, and just to define what traditionalism is the viewpoint where you say, no, Joseph Smith was inspired. He spoke to God. The foundation he laid is true. And we can build, the Book of Mormon is the most correct book. It is historically accurate. And we can trust that. And we build our foundation from there to continue to reveal many great and glorious things, build Zion, all of that, right? So from a traditionalist perspective, they're going to say, wait, Fiona, Mormon is the one, think about this for a second. He didn't just write the Book of Mormon. He also wrote the 2/3 sealed portion that none of us are righteous enough to have right now, right? Like, I'm sure like you guys, myself, we're trying the very best we can. It's not like we're trying to do the wrong thing, but we're not, as a people, we're not worthy enough to have the 2/3 portion that Mormon put together. That's the scripture for the millennium. So Mormon is the guy that God specifically picks to put together the scriptures that we'll have during the millennium. Not only that, but the Book of Mormon that we have, historians are looking.
It's called the Book of Mormon too. It's named after him.
Right. But the Book of Mormon manuscript that we have, there's estimates that have been done that actually the Book of Lehi was probably as long as the Book of Mormon portion we have today. So the Book of Mormon, actually, if we had not lost the Book of Lehi, we say 116 pages, but that's the long pages they're writing the script on, right? That would have actually equaled probably about the same amount of the Book of Mormon we have today. So we lost half of the Book of Mormon that Mormon put together. So we actually have less than 1/3 of the Book of Mormon right now. Mormon puts all of that together. That's who we're talking about. Mormon, the one who saw the Lord as a teenager, the one who's, this is who Mormon is. So from a traditionalist perspective, you're going to say no. And the Lord said Joseph Smith said it's the most correct book. The Lord said the translation, the Lord put his own character to it, right? In the Doctrine and Covenants, he says, as the Lord your God liveth, it is true. That means when Mormon sits down, he says, this is what happened. Nephi is thinking this, Laman and Lemuel is thinking this. It's not a biased, warped history from Nephi's perspective, but that is a huge battleground right now. Richard Bushman's wife, Claudia Bushman, the author of Richard Bushman wrote Rough Stone Ruling. His wife wrote a paper called I, Nephi. It's basically she believes the Book of Mormon is warped history, that the reason why it focuses on men is because it's chauvinist and just reflects our oppressive religion that oppresses women, and just all of this more progressive ideology. It's
basically Mormon, Moroni, Nephi weren't in a cultural vacuum.
Right. Yes, they're right. Exactly. And we're progressing in this knowledge of God. And that's why we've got to change the church and adapt our history, because we know more today than Paul did, more today than Joseph Smith did. And we've got to adapt as the world and better intellectuals as we get this greater enlightenment. Sorry, that was
It's a
long.
bunch of, like, sorry to cut you off. I'm hearing a lot of like, we know better. It's basically this like pride of intellectualism and, society of today. It sounds like a lot of these people are just basically under the influence and the drunkenness of society today with all this, these like philosophies that are being pushed and these ideas, ideologies, so on and so forth. Now, one problem that I've seen with Utah for a long now, I'm from Utah. I lived there till I was 28, born and raised there, then I left. But I think, and this may explain some of these people, this is why I'm bringing this up. You have a very dense or a very saturated society there of members of the church, right? And so if you're born into a family and spiritually on the inside, you're not very strong. Like if you were born here in Kansas, for example, where there aren't very many Latter-day Saints, you would probably just like fall away from the church, But if you're in Utah and this is the society that you live in, and there are some advantages to remaining LDS, like for example, getting married, fitting in with your neighbors.
Right. It's definitely more cultural. I'm right here in Utah as we speak. So yes.
Yeah. So on and so forth. Then instead of falling away from the church, you'd probably stick with it, but you may only stick with it in name only. And hence you have the Sunday, members of the church where they're just like doing what they have to do to maintain that status of being a member of the church. So again, I have no knowledge of this man or any of them, but it very well could be that they're kind of these people. It's a cultural thing, so they just kind of stick with it, but they want to, for example, what's the first guy's name? The one that we're talking about? I already forgot it.
Leonard. Yeah.
What was that?
Leonard?
Okay.
Leonard Arrington. Yeah.
Yeah. Leonard. Okay. Leonard. Okay. Leonard is easy to remember because I went to Fort Leonard Wood for basic training when I was in the Army. So, okay. Leonard. So it very well could be that he's one of these types, and then he doesn't have the conviction to go on a mission, doesn't have the conviction to continue reading the Book of Mormon over and over like he should.
He didn't see value in it. He just didn't see value.
Well, didn't you say that he didn't even read the whole thing?
He read it through once when he was 13.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he read it the one time, but he didn't read it over and over again. Like we all should. We should be continually reading the Book of Mormon, and all the scriptures. So it's pretty clear that he didn't have that conviction, right? And then he goes into the university, studies. He becomes this academic, like we've said, and he's more influenced, it would seem, by academia. And so so of course it's like, well, I want to maintain my LDS status, but I actually feel more like this. I got to find a way to merge the two. And I think that's what a lot of them do. They want to have like both worlds, and so they try and combine it. Or if it's not that, the worst case scenario is that you're just a bad person. And I'm not calling him a bad person, I don't know him, but he could be someone that is knowingly doing this for other reasons, such as, like I said before, attention, honor, because maybe he has a grandiose fantasy of like, I'm going to be the one to like, fix this and everyone's going to remember my name. So basically, a legacy or whatever, a grandiose fantasy of having a legacy. Only the Lord knows and only he knows. But I'm just saying that these are possibilities of how these things happen with both him and any of these other progressive or moderate or whatever they want to label themselves.
I think it's important to recognize, just from my own personal conversations with different progressive people, or there's definitely this feeling of we can do better, right? So they're looking at the church and they say, hey, in our past, we're very oppressive to women, or we've had these really false cultural ideas. Basically, the phrase, and you, once you start discovering this foundation and you pick up these phrases, you start looking for it, you'll see it everywhere. The idea that Joseph Smith was a product of his time, that prophets are a product of their time, right? So it's this thing of, well, we can look at Joseph Smith and he had some great ideas, but some of his ideas were frankly nonsense. This is, I'm just kind of trying to summarize this viewpoint and saying, you know what, and we just kind of need to brush that under the rug, and we need to move forward, and we need to we can do better. We can build a better church. We can build a better world. And of course, if you believe, if you believe that God's revelation in the scriptures is true, you're going to say, no, that's the ideal. We're trying to work towards that. We're not moving away from that is only going to cause heartache and destruction. So again, it's like different worldviews. And the reason why this matters is when it comes to the history, as we're talking here and people are probably like, well, I don't believe any of these things. This is the worldview and the foundation of the progressive history. Namely, I'll give you some specifics. This is the foundation behind the idea that Joseph Smith translated the Book of Mormon with a seer stone and not the Urim and Thummim. This is the foundation. These are the people behind the movement to say Joseph Smith was involved in treasure digging and his family were involved in folk magic. This is the philosophy that is behind the idea that the scriptures are not reliable, that we need to, maybe it's not completely historical, which is what our youth are being hit with so heavily, even at universities like BYU, to the point that now we're having professors teaching in class that Joseph of Egypt may have been gay, and we don't really know the gender identity of God. And like, this is out there publicly, it's becoming more prominent.
I know which professor you're talking about.
Right. And so, and the key to realize is this started how if you go look at how communism takes out different nations, how Satan always works, there's a pattern. He comes into a culture and he destroys the people's identity, their understanding of who they are. So when Mao goes into China, what does he do? He destroys the history. He literally, they tear down the monuments, they destroy the libraries, they destroy the artifacts, they destroy the art. They're trying to wipe out the past to create the brave new world, right? And so it's the same thing where if we can get rid of our past, of our Latter-day Saint history, our doctrine, a lot of it is derived from our history. And what I mean by that is not that our doctrine doesn't come from God, but history teaches us who God is. The Book of Mormon is just a history book. If you really step back and look at it, it's just a history book. But from the history, we learn who God is because we can see him in action. We see how he lives. Rather than just saying God loves people, we see what does love really look like? What does honor really look like?
Okay, so now let's segue here for a second. It's the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
Leonard Arrington is the church historian, and we've got a book.
Right.
The book. What's the name of the book?
Story of the Latter-day Saints. Is that the one I'm getting? I mean,
yes,
there's a bunch. So
I'm sorry.
I'm trying to follow exactly,
but
I think that's where you're headed.
Right. Okay. Yeah. And this goes back to Mormonism Unveiled is the beginning probably of it, right? And we got Hurlbut, and we've got Fawn Brody.
Yes.
No Man Knows My History. Right? Or my story. No, it's No Man Knows
No Man Knows My History.
Right. And these aren't new things.
Right.
They were when the prophet was alive, these things were coming out.
There's nothing in the progressive history that's new, really. I mean, like you're saying, it's only what the critics and the anti-Mormons have been saying for hundreds of years.
Right. So I want you to talk, if it's okay, about the book and how that transpired, where he fudged his journal entry and Harold B. Lee and all that stuff. It gets crazy, Jared. It gets crazy.
It's already pretty crazy.
I'll send you this book. Much more. You should order the book. It's only $20. If you just order this one, but if you get the whole series, it's like $69 or something.
Yeah.
Okay. So so it's the 70s. He's church historian. And I wanted to say just briefly, these names that John DeLynn, and I'm kind of jumping ahead, but mentioned didn't shock me Spencer Fluman, he's the Maxwell Institute guy. Phil Barlow, Terrell Givens, Fiona Givens, Richard Bushman, Adam Miller, Patrick Mason. I always had kind of interesting feelings when I would hear him. I would even add Ben Spackman, but that's my opinion. But anyway, let's go. You're like, I'm not going there. I'll ask you later.
There's a lot. There's a lot, and they seem to grow every
later
year.
About
So
when someday about how they treat you, or if they've given you any props in the academia world. You're probably considered fringy. Who knows? But anyway, so
it's
here's
always been fringy too. What does Paul say? I'm considered a fool.
Right.
Yeah, that's what the church is. We're a peculiar people, like by
we are a
definition, the
peculiar
entire
people.
church.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I want to add, I just want to just make one comment on that. The reason why it is so important to maintain our foundation, I'm gonna jump ahead just like why it matters.
No, you're good.
Just for a second.
Go for it.
Is because, and this is something I have a personal testimony of myself, and every person has to go on the journey to gain this knowledge for themselves. But I can bear my personal testimony that I know without a shadow of a doubt that the teachings that Joseph Smith gave us, both in his revelations, including the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, the Book of Abraham, which is heavily under attack, and then also his teachings that he gave, in D&C 21, the Lord gives the charter to the church. This is April 6, 1830, first day, and the Lord gives this charter. It's D&C 21, where he basically says, this is your mission, church. Members, this is what I want you to do. And he says, give heed to all of Joseph Smith's words and commandments as he receiveth them, walking in all holiness before me. He says, if you do this, the gates of hell will not prevail against you. The force of darkness will disperse before you. And when I look in the world today, let's face it, guys, like our statistics are not doing well. Temple marriages are falling apart. Families are falling apart. Pornography rates are rampant. Look at the nation. We're falling apart. Utah is has one of the highest uses of antidepressants. Like the forces of darkness are definitely prevailing against us in so many ways. We're having a massive faith crisis, especially among our millennials and Gen Zs, but now it's through all ages.
And Book of Mormons, you say in the book that there was 1 million placed at one time in the mission field, and then it went down to 500,000.
Oh yes, with Bruce McConkie's study.
Yeah,
that's right.
Right,
yes.
right.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that was interesting when he said there's something really wrong.
Yes,
really wrong with the testimonies of even missionaries at the MTC.
Yes. Okay.
Well, I'll need to get that reference from you because I'd like to look into that more.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes. No, that's a great story. Okay, you guys are bringing up all sorts of great.
Go ahead.
stories.
You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yes,
The
let's do that because
the anonymous survey that they did.
Yes, and I have it right here. So they did a study at I believe it was the MTC. So this is 1984. Okay, so we're jumping around. I hope viewers are probably so confused.
They're used to that on my channel.
Yes.
I'm sorry, it's me, man. I'm scatterbrained.
No, you're good. So 1984, Richard Bushman publishes Joseph Smith and the Beginnings of Mormonism. This is the forerunner to Rough Stone Rolling. And the reason why I think Rough Stone Rolling matters is because that book is pushed so heavily by progressives. It's probably, I would say, one of the most influential things the progressive movement has done, and in my opinion, it is destroying testimonies. But and it is actually
called?
Rough Stone Rolling.
Oh no, not Rough Stone Rolling. What was the other one? The predecessor.
Oh yeah, Joseph Smith and the Beginnings of Mormonism. Okay. So Richard Bushman actually had the manuscript. He was going to publish it through the church, through Leonard Arrington. So Leonard Arrington had commissioned the series. He asked Richard Bushman to write the first volume. And then controversy erupted among the Quorum of the 12. They said, we will not publish this. They basically ended up stopping the project. Richard Bushman publishes his manuscript independently on his own. So it's the same year. So this is 1984. Bruce McConkie revealed that they did a survey at the MTC in Provo, and they were asking people in this anonymous survey, the missionaries, to say, rank the strength of their testimony in these areas. 1, God is my Father, Father of my spirit. 2, Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. 3, Joseph Smith is a prophet. 4, the Book of Mormon is the Word of God. And 5, Spencer W. Kimball is a prophet today. And so they ranked like how firmly they knew that was true. And Troy, you've read the book, so what would you guess is the 2 weakest areas at the MTC in 1984? It was
it wasn't God. It wasn't belief in God. It was Joseph Smith and the Book of Mormon.
The Book of Mormon. Yeah. So Elder McConkie said, whoa, what is happening? Like, that should be right after God, like Jesus Christ, like that should be right there at the top. Why is that our weakest point? And he said, something's wrong, something's terribly wrong. We've got to fix this. And then he said that a while back, they had changed the missionary discussions to make the first discussion about Jesus Christ, whereas before the first discussion had been on Joseph Smith and the first vision. And he said that when they switched that and took the emphasis off the restoration and picture it more like turning our missionary discussions more like we're just kind of any other Christian church. We just are only talking about Jesus. So you're losing the message of the restoration. You're losing the centrality of Joseph Smith. He said that when they did that, it dropped, like you said, a decrease in convert baptisms, a decrease in the number of copies of the Book of Mormon placed by full-time missionaries from 1 million to 500,000. And so then Elder McConkie said, we are not teaching the restoration as we ought to. Now, people would say that doesn't make sense. Isn't Jesus Christ the focus? We don't worship Joseph Smith. Isn't the whole purpose of Joseph Smith to get us to Jesus Christ? And the reason why this is important is because who is Jesus Christ, right? We could sit here on this channel and be like, follow Jesus and focus on Jesus. Who is Jesus? Because that's what they've been battling in Christendom for thousands of years, really since the dawn of time. Who is the real God? That is what was so important about Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith came to clarify, this is who the real Jesus Christ is. Take Joseph Smith out, we lose who the real God is, and then we all think we're worshiping God, and we're not actually getting to the real Jesus Christ. Satan isn't afraid of the name Jesus. He's afraid of us understanding who Jesus Christ really is. And I think that's why Joseph Smith is so important, and why the devil is so, watch what the devil focuses on to know where the key battle line is. And he is so focused so heavily, destroy Joseph Smith's character, destroy his teachings, get us moved away. We've got to bury him and move on. So I'm trying to remember how we got off on this, where we were trying to get.
Because man, I mean, you talk about the church, the idea of it being just a regular church, like any Protestant church. In the book, you talk it. I was flabbergasted about the Community of Christ, even.
Yes.
That they watered down everything. They've denounced.
That's the direction they went.
They've denounced baptisms for the dead. They gave the LGBTQ, the community, the priesthood. Before that, females, the priesthood. And so we see what happens when we lose our testimony of the prophet Joseph Smith and the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ.
Right.
In the last dispensation of the fullness of times.
Well, in the belief that prophets really are who they say they are. Because again, a lot of this with like the way that you were describing the progressives, Hannah, is that they feel that they need to fix the church, that they know better now. And that's not how the church is run. If you understand the role of a prophet, he is the mouthpiece of the Lord. That means like, just like this microphone, that's all that the prophet is. Like when you hear him speaking or general authorities, it says in the scriptures that whatever my servants say, it's as though I'm saying it myself. And so it's like you're kind of putting a separation between the apostles, the prophet, and the Lord, and you're just focusing them as church leaders and men that are products of their time.
The bureaucracy.
And that's a pretty fundamental misunderstanding and divide in how we understand the role of prophets. And so, um, yeah, but that's like the prevailing thing, and I feel like that's what they're trying to push in the university. The one, like the progressive professors and stuff, is that we need to, you know, have movements, we need to affect change. And that's why you see things like in 2020 there was a protest of BYU students at church headquarters, as though that's how things change in the church. Again, it's like totally ignoring the fact that it's being led by Christ himself. It's just like, no, it's just a church, and we need to make our voices heard, and this will bring about change. And so it's that's kind of like a big deal, because our church, unlike others, is it has this foundational belief of the prophet. So if you're in some other church like the Presbyterian church, which I think that they run off of basically councils, it's like, oh yeah, that is how you how you make change, is you make your voice known. In councils they have like I think like yearly convenings of councils or whatever, and that's how you do it. But not with our church. We have an actual prophet. So it just anyway, it's just, I
Yeah,
can't
and we're led by revelation, right, Jared?
Yeah.
Jared, you brought up something very interesting. Why do they stay in the church? Why do these intellectuals? Because I was asking my wife last night when we were reading this amazing book. I love this book, and I'm gonna finish it. But why do they stay in the church? And then I said, their degree is useless outside of Utah. You know, they have family members. You mentioned in the book, they have family that it might be, they have this affinity still for the organization, but their pride, their ego, their education. And if you have a degree in church history, it means nothing outside of Utah, really.
Yeah.
So they have this grandiose thing where they just gotta make a difference or do something. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And a big key is, do we actually believe that the teachings in the scriptures are the solution to the world's problems? Do we really believe that what Joseph Smith taught on liberty, on doctrine, on the family, on women, do we believe that that will bring us to help us build Zion, to actually solve the problems in society? You know, it was, I don't know, are you guys aware of who Hiram Andrus was?
Yes.
Yes. So he was going to go into other careers paths, you know, because he's like, well, we've got all these world problems we've got to solve. And he ended up focusing on Joseph Smith, because he said he realized from studying Joseph Smith that Joseph Smith's teachings and the foundation he laid could solve every societal and world problem that we have. That is something that I believe we're missing, even among good-hearted people. It was a piece that I was missing myself, understanding this will work. The gates of hell won't prevail if we give heed to Joseph Smith's words and commandments, like D&C 21. And that is the way to bring joy. The heal your marriage, you can choose. You can try the world's way, you can try the Lord's way. To raise children, you can try the Lord's way or the world's way. And you know what? You can pick either one. I think if we look at our statistics today, a lot of people are trying the world's way and it's not working.
Right.
But this foundation will work. And again, from a progressive viewpoint, no. From the progressive viewpoint, it's the scriptures that caused this problem in the first place. The reason why we have oppression of women and class struggle is because of the scriptures. They say, well, it's actually the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith and Brigham Young and other people that got us to this place. We've got to reverse the damage, rather than it's the antithesis, right? Whereas a traditionalist, or what I would bear testimony to, is no, it's actually Joseph Smith's foundation, Joseph Smith's teachings actually have the solution to all of those problems. And that's where we disagree.
Right.
Yeah. And it's because it's not his, it's the Lord's. He's the prophet of the Lord.
Right.
You know, I think another way you can look at it is like when you look at Judaism in the United States, there's three main divisions in Judaism. You have Orthodox, you have conservative, kind of in the middle, and then you have Reform. And there's a couple other groups, like you have Reconstructionist, which is kind of like Reform, and then you have ultra Orthodox, which is like the Haredim and
Right.
stuff like that. But anyway, those are like the three main divisions, right? And it's kind of like a question of how strictly they adhere to halakha, which is the
Mhm.
Jewish law. It's like Sharia, but for Judaism.
Yeah.
And it's weird because like the further down that spectrum you go toward Reform, once you're like to Reform, it's like they don't really believe in the divinity of Torah or that those things actually happened.
Yes.
It's like they've basically reduced Judaism to just kind of like a tradition in a club, and like, let's do this for fun. You know,
The same thing that's happening in our church, right? It's been
yeah, it's
reduced
like,
to, it's a social thing. We get together, we have our
yeah.
word Christmas party, and we have our 2-hour meeting. And
But the problem is for the progressives, like they can't really break off and do their own progressive church. I guess they could. I don't know if it'll ever get to that point.
They
But
usually
because
just
like with
stop going to
Judaism, it's
church.
not really, there's no central figure, leader, authority. So it's more of, whenever I talk to them about it, like I talk to this rabbi every other week in Israel, they view it as like a tribe, and you can kind of just like do what you want, and there's kind of authority, but there's kind of not. So there's more liberty just to kind of spread out and do whatever you want to. Whereas with our church, there's not. So I don't know. It'll just be interesting to see what happens uh as we move forward and as the divide grows.
yeah, and the reason why I believe that this is really, I believe that we're at a turning point right now, because so Leonard Arrington writes all these journals, right? And don't worry, Troy, will come back to your story, the story of the Latter-day Saints and turning it really is
The book.
fascinating going through these journals and diaries of Leonard Arrington, because he recorded all of these conflicts. And I mean, they went to the point where you've got members of the Quorum of the 12 having people trying to spy on the progressives to figure out what are they up to. And then you got progressives and they're spying and they're smuggling out like letters from Ezra Taft Benson. Ezra Taft Benson writes a letter to
I'm
somebody.
looking at
then,
Jared's face and he's just like in shock.
Well, I'm just like, it's like, who are they mental? Like, what's wrong with
There
these
is,
people?
you know, they say there's more than one way to Mormon. You know, they say that.
yes. Yeah, oh, that, and that's a big phrase. Like even
Yeah.
Sunstone
Well,
uses
there's
it.
also more about the church that the lay people of the church don't know, you know.
Right. and so, and the reason why it matters is this is a battle for the heart of the faith. And that's why I think people don't realize. And I hope we can have time to talk a little bit later. Like people talk about the translation. They're like, Hannah, why does it matter? Who cares? Well, I'll explain why it matters. How this changing our history, changing our culture, it's going to restructure the entire way we look at our faith and whether we even have a faith that's recognizable in 50 years. You know, Joseph Fielding Smith, I forget the year. I think it was in the 1920s. He went home from a meeting at church headquarters with different people. And we have this quote in the book, and he wrote in his journal, he said that he was very disturbed. He said he was seeing a ton of secularism and humanism coming into the church faculty, and they were bringing these ideas and into their work in the church. And he writes in his journal, he said, if we move as far in the last, oh shoot, my mind is blanking. Is it 50 or 20 years?
You know, I find it, while you're just real quick,
Yeah.
it's interesting that this didn't just start in the 70s. It was back in the turn of the century when they were in even the late 19th century, you know, with when they were doing seances and, you know,
yes,
spiritualism was on the rise, and Darwinism. But anyway, go ahead.
No, so we actually, interestingly enough, we go into that in Faith Crisis 1. There was a huge movement of people who apostatized from the church. Leonard Arrington actually praised the leader of this, but he actually ended up apostatizing in Brigham Young's day, got into spiritualism, and he believed that Joseph Smith and Heber C. Kimball were speaking to him through these witches, mediums, and telling him, oh, you know, you've got to fix, like, Joseph Smith started this foundation, but we've got to progress further. There's more light and knowledge to come, and we need to change this about the scriptures. There's flaws in the Doctrine and Covenants. Basically, everything the progressive narrative is pointing today, these witches were literally having seances and communicating these messages to these apostates in the 1800s. So it's not new. Sometimes when people are like, well, this is in the last 100 years, I'm like, actually, this is kind of the same story we've been fighting for a long time. It's just the consequences are becoming more serious because it's becoming more prominent, it's becoming more established, and it's taking out our youth.
Oh, well,
Yeah, it's human, it's simply human nature. That's why again, you go back to the time of Christ, and you have a division in Judaism between Essenes, Zealots, Pharisees, Sadducees. Like there were these different schools of thought of how to deal with the Romans, how to view the future, how to interpret things, whatever. It's just human nature. But one thing that's happening right now is we're attached to the world in the sense that the more the world becomes secular in whatever, it has an effect on our church and our members. So I think a lot of it comes, from there, from what the world's doing, because these people that want to please the world, want to fit in with the world, they have a problem, because the divide is becoming larger and larger between the church and the world. And so it's like either just fall away from the church and leave the church behind, or stay in it and then do like what they're trying to do and try and change the church, and then okay, problem solved.
Right.
Well, you said the kids, that they're hurting the youth, right?
Right.
The future of the church. President Benson, and I marked that where it I don't know if this was a quote, Wilkinson recorded in his diary, President Benson's fear that in their attempt to satisfy and ingratiate themselves with historians, they have neglected the future destiny of young people in the church.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. And so a lot of people come to me and say, okay, well, you're talking about Leonard Arrington and Joseph Smith and money digging. Well, now our youth are leaving over bigger things. They're leaving over LGBT issues, or they're leaving over women's rights and the gender issues, right? And what we're missing is, how did we get here? How did we get to this point in 2022? We got here over a steady moving away from our foundation over time that started all the way back in the 1900s. I mean, technically, you could say Satan was trying to do it all the way back in 1830, but this movement and the reason, back to Leonard Arrington's diaries, he said he did not want them published, he said, until it was like 20 or 25 years after his death. And then his kids talked him down to 10 years because he was like, people aren't going to be ready to hear what's in these diaries. But they convinced him down. They were like, I think we'll have one by then. 2010 is when about the 10-year thing expired, 2009. So he was like, by then, a lot of I love it how Greg Prince, you showed that biography that Greg Prince wrote of Leonard Arrington. And he said by then enough of Leonard Arrington's enemies had died. So they were gone. They're out of the picture, the people. And so now it was kind of like Leonard Arrington could take the stage and he becomes the hero, right? Because who had died? Boyd K. Packer, Ezra Taft Benson.
The traditionalists.
Joseph
Fielding Smith.
Yes. And it was really this conflict. Like there's a quote in there where Leonard Arrington writes, and he's like, it's like when a horse is plowing and it's got horse flies all over, saying he was the plow horse and President Benson and others are the horse flies. And he's like, what do you do? Sake. He's like, what do you do when the plow horse is getting, he's like, the plow horse has just got to keep moving. Like we just got to keep going. And then
I find it interesting. He was asked, when are the brethren going to finally?
Yes.
Go ahead. What did he say?
Yeah. So Carolyn Pearson. So she's the one that wrote a lot of the lyrics behind the songs in the Living Scriptures cartoons, believe it or not. So songs that I actually know almost word for word because I grew up on a lot of
the old cartoon videos.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. She's the one who wrote My
We
Turn
used to
on
use
Earth.
them on my mission. We would show little kids
Yes.
Yeah. I like those.
Yes, I do too. I do too.
The
Funny enough,
miracles.
yes, many of those lyrics were written by a lady named Carolyn Pearson.
And Lex
She,
Diaz Avedo, right?
yeah, he did the music.
Yeah.
Yes.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. So, and then Carolyn Pearson, she wrote like My Turn on Earth, some different scripts for
Did
BYU
she do
videos.
Saturday's Warriors too, or no?
I
Or
don't
that
think
was somebody
so.
different?
I don't
Okay.
think so. I don't know if Lex Diaz Avedo did the lyrics on those two, but I don't know.
Okay, but go ahead.
But
Sorry.
so she's still alive today, and she is one of the top most vocal critics of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young with plural marriage. She is pushing for the removal of D&C 132 from our scriptures. She's a strong feminist. She believes the Book of Mormon's biased history.
Is she still a member?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
So she was good friends with Leonard Arrington, and she sat down with him once and she said, Leonard, do you think we're ever going to get to the point to where the brethren will say, we're not the one true church, we're just a pretty darn well good church, she said. And he said, yeah.
And what year was it? Do you know what year she asked him
I'm
this?
trying to remember this,
Because I think it's hilarious.
Mm-hmm.
It's a laughing, because we're not.
They don't view it as a church or a religion. They just view it as a club. They view it as a thing to do,
right?
As an identity, but like just a hollow shell, really.
Right.
It's like, why even do, just what are you doing?
Right. Yes. And he said, so this is on page 183 of the Faith Crisis 2. He said, seriously, he said, I think within 20 years we'll be ready for that. I don't know when the year is on that.
It was probably in the 80s, maybe.
That's
maybe
what
90s.
I would guess.
When did he die?
99.
Okay, so it could have been early 90s, late 80s, whatever.
Yeah. Yes.
But it's 2023 and we're still testifying of the prophet Joseph Smith.
Right.
In general conference.
Yes. Yes. A lot of people have asked me about the proclamation on the restoration. They're like, that's interesting. I'm like, yes, it is. So, but he said within 20 years, because he said young people today are not buying everything that they're told. But again, and the key with that is, and this is where sometimes progressives will be like,
he was right about there being a faith crisis in 20 years, but good.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Where people will say, well, Hannah, like, what are you saying? Are you saying, the Baptists don't have anything, or that there's no good Muslims out there, good Catholics? And I'm like, no, absolutely. I'm the first person. So I grew up in a home where my dad was really, really big on learning how to appreciate different cultures and different viewpoints. So we would watch movies about Christians being persecuted in other countries. We read lots of books of Muslims who had converted to Christianity, and some came from radical Islam, some came from more moderate Islam, and the benefits too. We grew up with Pentecostals and Jehovah's Witnesses and Catholics, and just learning that there are so many good people. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about the one true church. We're not saying that there's not good people and that there's not truth everywhere, because obviously the great apostasy happened and there was truth everywhere in different corrupted forms. The reason why Joseph Smith came was to say, let's get back to the pure source. Joseph Smith said, water always tastes best from the source, basically not through the irrigation ditch, right? Do you want your water down there, or do you want to go clear it right up to the spring? That's what Joseph Smith did. He said, let's get to the pure form. Let's get back to that. And that foundation is true. That's what we're battling over, really, with, if you really had to bring it down to progressives versus traditionalists, what are we fighting over? Traditionalists are saying Joseph Smith was the second greatest prophet ever to live. That's coming from presidents of the church. A lot of people freak out. They're like, what? Like, what are you saying, Hannah? And I'm like, it's presidents of the church. You can go to our website, LDS Answers. We have all the statements, statement after statement after statement. It's right in our Doctrine and Covenants. No man has done more good for the salvation of men in this world save Jesus Christ. So it's Jesus Christ and then Joseph Smith. And Joseph Smith didn't have those revelations, and he didn't lay that foundation because, we were just up there in the premortal life and we had a lottery, and Joseph Smith happened to draw out of the hat for that role, and I happened to draw the hat for my role, and Moses drawed his. No, like, Joseph Smith was able to do the work that he did because of his character.
We wouldn't have
because-
patriarchal blessings. We wouldn't be told in our patriarchal blessing that we were valiant, noble, and faithful, or that
Mhm.
we followed the Lord and Savior.
Right.
There's reasons why we get those answers in those patriarchal blessings,
Right.
because we were foreordained. We
Mhm.
were well, not predestination like Calvinism, but
No,
we
but
were
yeah,
foreordained to do
Mhm.
certain things.
absolutely.
There were the valiant, noble, and faithful.
Yes. And Joseph Smith was one of those very valiant people, and he brought that character to his life. And so this is, you mentioned you read the last chapter of Faith Crisis 2,
Yeah.
where this is a huge battleground. It's saying, where they say, well, Joseph Smith was basically, he was a money digger. He had a vengeful temper. These are all quotes from like Rough Stone Rolling. His family was all involved in folk magic. His father was a drunk who abdicated family leadership. That's Joseph Smith Sr. We're talking about Father Smith. Oh my goodness. Like
The patriarch of the church.
right. And the problem is none of us know our history today. So they can start throwing out accusations like Elizar's know this and Joseph Smith Sr. this, and none of us know our history because there was a calculated effort to remove us from that. And now they can say, oh, well, Joseph Smith was basically a bump on a log, but he still did great work. Character doesn't matter. And that's Leonard Arrington. Clinton is going through all of the sex scandals with his presidential campaign. And Leonard Arrington says, I don't really care. What he does in his private life doesn't impact who he is as president of the United States. Same approach to Joseph Smith. Whereas we say, no, if you go to the Book of Mormon, Mormon says, a good fountain cannot produce bitter water, and a bitter fountain cannot produce good water. Joseph Smith did the work that he did because he had character and because of the man that he was.
Can I ask you something real quick, Hannah?
Yeah.
Would you say that a lot of the research that Bushman, he got stuff from like Hurlbut, and he got stuff from Von just a lot of the critics. Okay.
Yeah.
So when you think about it, his book isn't much different from some of the anti-Mormon books that were written in the past.
Yeah.
Basically. So would you say that a lot of the research and the sightings, the quotes, the references that he had, are they secondhand accounts, third-hand accounts, like 99% of them, would you say?
Well, right. Well, like, let's take the.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes.
There's
yes,
no
I do.
smoking gun. There's really no smoking gun.
Yes. It's funny. We talk about all this, like it's these new discoveries, and you're like, there's nothing new. But this, okay, yes, the use of sources. This is a fundamental thing because so when Richard Bushman's writing Rough Stone Rolling, he said specifically when it came to the whole discussion of Joseph Smith and magic, he said in the past, Latter-day Saint historians had been like, we can't trust the Mormonism Unveiled affidavits, Blastus Hurlbut's affidavits. What that was, just as like a 30-second version, is in the early 1830s, there was a member of the church, his name was Blastus Hurlbut, who was excommunicated from the church for immorality issues. And they have a church court. He goes to the council and he just cries and he's like, I'm so sorry. I just am so sorry. Like, please give me another chance. So they give him another chance. Hurlbut walks out and Joseph Smith says, that man is not honest. Like, just wait and see. Like,
was this the same guy that had spiritual wives? That's not the same guy. Okay, sorry.
Nope.
Okay.
But you're probably thinking of John C. Bennett.
Okay, yeah.
Later in Nauvoo. Yes.
Right,
so this is
he's another one,
era.
but anyway, good.
And
but Hurlbut said he would wash his hands in the blood of Joseph Smith.
Yes, because what happens was he got them to keep his membership. He walks out of that council and he gets caught a short time later bragging that he had deceived Joseph Smith's God and the Spirit. Like, that council believed me. What idiots. So they call him back in, they excommunicate him formally, and then he goes on this revenge track. He's actually funded to go back east and dig up any dirt, interview neighbors, people who said they had known the Smiths, dig up all the dirt for, again, he's being paid, bring it back to this anti-Mormon committee to get it published. So he goes back east And he interviews people like Willard Chase, some of Emma Smith's family, Emma's father, different people, and he collects all of these affidavits. There's debate on whether those affidavits are even legit, but regardless, whether
Or
or
if
not
he
they are,
really even did the interviews,
right?
you know,
Yeah.
who
So
knows?
there's debate, but whether he did or not, he brings them back, and before he can get them published, he literally gets Joseph Smith has to file a legal complaint against him for threatening his life, and they have this whole court, and Hurlbut is actually convicted, and then it comes out that Hurlbut's wife had an affair with one of the Baptist ministers. So Hurlbut's character is pretty much not reputable at this point, in or outside the church. And so he gives all of his material to E.D. Howe, who publishes it under the book Mormonism Unveiled. It was the first really significant anti-Mormon publication. A lot of people don't realize this is the first that we've been able to find so far. This is the first documented place where the Searstone narrative comes from. It comes from Mormonism Unveiled, the idea that Joseph Smith had to put a dark rock in a hat, read words off of it. That's coming from Mormonism Unveiled. So when Mormonism Unveiled comes out, the first presidency actually comes out, and they make a statement. They're like, this is the most ridiculous stories that were ever invented, in a few affidavits, but it just enraged the public because they were ticked, and it was pushing all this stuff. Joseph Smith was a money digger. Joseph Smith was involved in magic and everything. So for generations, all the Latter-day Saint historians, including people like Hugh Nibley and others, they said, this is nonsense. We don't trust this at all. This is like trying to write Jesus Christ's life and going to Herod or Caiaphas or Judas Iscariot and saying, tell us about Jesus. What did he teach? What kind of a man was he, right? What kind of story are you going to get? Well, then you get to Richard Bushman, and he says, well,
Or going to the Sanhedrin and asking about Jesus Christ.
Right. Exactly.
Well, yeah.
Yes. They're like, oh, we'll tell you all sorts of things about him.
Right.
We'll see. And just really quick, this highlights the importance of research. Like if you're going to study a subject, you need to go to authoritative sources, but you also have to like understand the context, the character of these people, like in this case.
Yep.
Because just because it's written in a book doesn't automatically give it authority, or doesn't mean that it's correct, doesn't mean that it's not biased. And that's something that I struggle with on my channel, because there's a lot of people that want me to like condense my videos down into like 15 minutes. And I do a lot of like pretty in-depth stuff, and it comes down to finding actual sources and going as deep as possible, because because your belief should be based on a solid foundation and brought back to the most authoritative source possible. And so, but some people just, they don't want to do that. It's too much work. And I don't blame them necessarily, but if it's like a really important thing, you better make sure that you understand exactly where that information is coming from. Otherwise, you're building on a sandy foundation.
Right.
Yes. And then you start building on top of that, and it just gets blown out of proportion.
Right. And in Richard Bushman's case, he knows better than any of us that actually where those sources came from. But in his view, he was like, well, if you go to academia, secular historians, they take Hurlbut as credible because they say, well, why wouldn't we trust him? Right.
Well, do you think that Bushman's book, Stone Rolling, influenced the gospel topics essays and things that we have in the church?
That's pretty well documented. Yes.
Okay.
And a lot of the people writing it, you can connect back.
Okay.
It's like a tree. They kind of all go back to Leonard Arrington. In fact, Leonard Arrington is actually the one who asked Richard Bushman.
Mentored them.
Yes, yeah. Mentored them. And actually, he's the one that asked Richard Bushman to write a biography of Joseph Smith originally. It was like, you got to get into this.
So why do you think, just real quick, why do you think, because I'm not saying the Searstone is, I don't have an opinion on it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I grew up, it was Urim and Thummim. I went on my mission in 1992 We taught the Urim and Thummim.
Yep.
We never taught a rock and a hat.
Joseph Fielding Smith said it was hearsay, so you're not the only one.
Right. And I think the brethren are like, we're going to have different opinions coming out of the woodwork now.
Mhm.
So that's why I think our prophet today is saying we need to have our own testimony of the gospel. It doesn't matter. We weren't Joseph Smith. We're not the prophet. He translated by the gift and power of God.
Mhm.
You know what I mean?
Right.
And
And
I think
it's a huge battle. It's being written by historians. And that's why, again, like this is like even this whole conversation we're having here, this is about history. This is about evaluating sources. This is not doctrine. Is not what we're sitting here discussing. Right.
Right.
So when it comes to how did Joseph Smith translate the Book of Mormon, it's a historical conversation.
We're looking at evidences.
Right. Because none of us were there. No one alive today was there. Unless you believe in reincarnation, which is not true. So,
well, and the hypocrisy too, like we're very inclusive. We have been since Joseph Smith and Brigham Young. Brigham Young said any truth out there that is truth is truth, and we embrace it.
Yeah.
We welcome it. It belongs to Mormonism.
We should not be censoring debate. We should not be censoring discussion. I'm like Richard Bushman, publish what you believe. That's fine. Let's have the conversation. Let's not have it behind closed doors. That's why we wrote the book called it Behind Closed Doors. But let me just finish on the sources thing, just wrap that up, because we were talking about Richard Bushman goes and says, hey, well, all the secular historians are accepting Mormonism unveiled. I had to too. Like I had to use these sources. So again, it's this difference where a progressive viewpoint is going to say Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin's testimony on Jesus Christ is equal, or sometimes even to be given more credit than Peter's testimony, because Peter's kind of biased. Peter could tend to exaggeration. So that was actually something Richard Bushman said when he wrote Rough Stone Rolling. He said he tended to not include as many faith promoting accounts, because he was like, a lot of them are written years later. They could be exaggerated, right? So it's again this viewpoint where it's like, take Hurlbut, he's credible. Parley P. Pratt, maybe not. So again, I like to use the example of Jesus Christ to put this in perspective. If you were a historian trying to write a book on the life of Jesus Christ, and you interviewed Caiaphas, and you interviewed Herod, or you interviewed Judas Iscariot, what kind of a narrative would they give you about Jesus Christ? Is it truly objective? Is there such a thing as objective, or is there's truth, there's reality? God knows what that is. And the closer you can get to God, the closer you can get to inspiration, the closer you get to that reality. And Peter, James, John, Mary Magdalene, even Paul, they're going to be able to give you a more accurate view of history. That's a big battle line. That's a difference in worldview, right? Leonard Arrington's going to say, we got to take all of these anti-Mormon sources. Someone like a Joseph Fielding Smith is going to look at it and say, this is coming from anti-Mormons, that people that hated Joseph Smith, people that didn't know Joseph Smith. And you can even prove, like when you actually go into Mormonism Unveiled, they contradict each other. I mean, the fact that we're using Mormonism Unveiled as a footnote, as a source, is so ironic to me. If you actually go into the book, they've got everything Joseph Smith doing animal sacrifices and killing a dog and dripping the blood around to do these rituals, and right. So it's like, well, do you really believe that is Joseph Smith? And if you do, then that's a completely different Joseph Smith. I mean, you can accept that Joseph Smith, but that's a completely different Joseph Smith than the Joseph Smith that has been promoted for 200 years.
I think Lucy Mack Smith, and let me know if I'm wrong, but I think she said, that was a rumor that was started about my son Joseph, because I think a guy that was wanting to mine silver.
Yes. So
hired
Smith
him
himself. Yep.
Hired him to do some work.
Mm-hmm.
And then she's like, yeah. And then all of a sudden he got labeled as the money digger.
Right.
Or the treasure seeker.
Joseph Smith was asked about it himself. And he said, I worked for Josiah Stoll as a common laborer. It was for a few months until I could convince him to stop digging for the Spanish mine. He's like, that is the full extent of it. right?
Was that after he received the plates or the revelations that he was hired? I mean,
it's in that process. That's when he meets Emma, is during that whole
when he
work.
was hired.
Yes.
Okay.
So it's before he starts the actual translation, but
Okay.
it's you know, and so, but whereas if you go read Rough Stone Rolling, Joseph Smith Sr. is basically leading the treasure hunts, and they're really deep involved into this. And Joseph Smith basically has to extradite himself from this bad culture of the money diggers, and so it's just
He almost portrays them as like gypsies almost.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's a quote that they take from Lucy Mack Smith, and they say Lucy Mack Smith admitted it herself. If you go read Lucy Mack Smith in context, she's
She didn't say that at all.
saying the opposite. So
Right.
there's a point where when we're battling this progressive history, there's a point where, yes, okay, we have different viewpoint. And then there's a point where I would say we're completely taking sources out of context, and we're not being completely honest and upfront about what we're actually the history that we're giving.
Right. How much
So
are you doing okay on time, Jared?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
I'm
good.
fine.
Good.
So an interesting thing with this that's been brought up is objectivity, right? Because that's the approach with which they're approaching it. Is that, oh well, we have to treat this like science, we have to use academic standards, and that's right, but they're completely okay. So there's the one side where, when we're looking at it objectively, that's where apologetics, or that's where the opposing point of view comes into play, where for example, the work that you do can point out and correct things in the other person's research, right? And so people that are genuinely looking for the truth, that's where you would have value, is they would come across your work and be like, oh, I didn't know that about this person, or I didn't know that was the actual context. So that's like one battleground. But the thing that these people ignore is the subjective reality, and there is subjective reality, and it's called receiving inspiration, receiving the witness of the Holy Ghost. And so that's something that for me is just as real as objective reality. And that's a lot of what our church is based on. Is okay, you have the missionaries over, they tell you to read the Book of Mormon and then pray about it, because it's one thing to read it and be like, this would have been hard to write for just one person. I'm not sure, I think I do believe it. That's one thing. But the other thing is actually having some kind of internal experience that you can't explain, and that you to your core is true. And so that's like another big part of it. I know that we're talking about academic things, and so yes, we there does need to be the work that you're doing and others to like correct the narrative. But when it really comes down to it, the biggest thing is receiving that direct witness from the Spirit. And just like Troy was saying earlier, President Nelson saying that you're not going to be able to survive spiritually in coming days without the constant guidance and influence of the Holy Ghost. It's probably because some of these other voices, like these guys, Bushman and Leonard or whatever, they're just going to get louder and louder and louder, and then it's going to be overwhelming for a lot of people that are, it's like there's like just so much information and so many people saying things that it's going to be critical more than ever to feel the Holy Ghost. And then to kind of like ease and soothe some of those doubts, come across things to back it up in an objective sense with like the work that you're doing. So but that's another thing, like these people, they only rely on scientific academic standards, and that's it. It doesn't seem like I don't know, you said that Leonard said that he felt he was being directed by the Holy Ghost and whatever, but anyway, I don't know. That's why
I don't even think he used the word Holy Ghost, though. He called us Holy Ghosters. I claim to be a Holy Ghoster.
I guess I do too. Of course I am.
I'm really glad you brought up this point, because we're not discussing like, well, educated people have this viewpoint, and then non-educated people have this other viewpoint. That's not what we're debating, right? You have Truman Madsen is a contemporary with Richard Bushman. They knew each other. Both of them were very educated. Both of them knew the sources. I don't think anyone could look at Truman Madsen and say, well, he just wasn't familiar with the history, right? He was just kind of
No, he
blindly
was
going off.
very, if you listen to his lectures on Joseph Smith and Kirtland, and oh my goodness,
Yes.
it's amazing.
Right. And so they're contemporary. So you got Truman Madsen and Richard Bushman. They were even on a project. We go into the book. This is in the book at the same time. So they definitely knew each other. Richard Bushman looks at the same sources that Truman Madsen looks at, and they both go completely different directions. So why is that, right? So this is not about, oh, if you're educated, you think this, or if you're in the sources and in the history, you think this. And this is not just an academic discussion, which I'm really glad you brought up. Because this is a big part where I feel like Leonard Arrington and other progressives misrepresent what traditionalists, what all of us mean when we say have a witness of the Spirit or obtain revelation. Because Leonard Arrington said when he joined the staff, he was like, I'm not hiring any Holy Ghosters, these people that say like, I know this is true and that's how it is, right? And he's like, well, you can't really know anything, right? For sure.
But we
Holy
can know,
Ghosters.
and I think that's part of the polarization in the church is
Yeah.
you have those who are the intellect, not just or those who haven't experienced that revelation from Moroni chapter 10 verses 3-5. We don't emphasize that as much anymore about praying and knowing if Joseph Smith is a prophet of God by direct revelation, by the power of the Holy Ghost. And you have people that get up and bear their testimony, like myself, like Jared, like you, and say, I know the gospel's true because the Spirit bore witness to me.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
There's almost that resentment by some that go, how can you know? You don't know. That's just, and that's what he
it's
meant,
just emotion
by Holy Ghoster.
Right. And like Leonard Arrington said, well, those people just try to influence students with emotion rather than we're more into the facts and the data, right? That is not what revelation is. Revelation is not emotion. Revelation is not mental thoughts. You can feel emotion, you can have mental thoughts. Revelation, according to the doctrine, like when you study Joseph Smith, you study the scriptures, it is communication from God to you. It's just the same. It's a different kind of communication, but it's just as much communication as you and I sitting here having this conversation. It's not just feeling. Yes, there's physical manifestations, but it's not just, oh, I felt emotional one day, right? And so this is a big thing where progressives are like, well, it's no different than if you go watch a movie and you feel goosebumps. Like, no, that is not revelation. We're talking about you can have things revealed. When Joseph Smith is talking to angels, he is talking to angels. When he sees history, Mormon said he saw our day. Moroni saw our day. They literally saw our day. They had an accurate view of history. We're talking about things they know.
Right. I've got about 20 minutes left. Is that okay?
Yeah.
I wanted to get into the book and the Harold B. Lee and then his sent to BYU.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Can you hold on just a second? I'll be right back. Like 2 seconds. Well, not 2 seconds, but I'll be right back.
Oh gosh, I gotta readjust. So is the foundation, is that what you do full time? Is that your main work?
It's a side project. So yeah, it's everything is actually volunteer. So
neat. And then sorry, where exactly again were you in Utah?
I'm about 20 minutes south of Provo. It's a little town called Salem.
Yeah, I know Salem. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. Some people are like, never heard of it.
Okay. So can we talk about that? Is that okay?
Yes.
So we got a book.
Right. So Leonard Arrington's writing this history, kind of flies undercover for the first few years. when he's, because people say, well, how would a guy like this be called as the church historian? Most of the members of the Quorum of the 12 like didn't know his viewpoint, where he's coming from, right? I mean, we're sitting here talking very openly because we have his diaries today, and we're talking about this decades later. But at the
Yeah,
time,
how did you get the diaries? Is
so
that
you can,
published somewhere else?
they are published now. Yes.
Did one of his family members just say, "Here, everybody"?
It was published by Signature Books. And so, there was a scholar that went through and edited
Okay.
them, and they're massive. They're
Wow.
huge.
So
And
they were published not to demean him. They were published for
yeah,
people who support him, celebrate his birthday.
Well, he wanted them published, right? But to wait at least 10
Yes.
years, right?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
And
Okay.
this is something they celebrate. They openly acknowledge this. If you go read Greg Prince's biography of Leonard Arrington, this is their hero, right? This is someone they look to who enacted change that, from their viewpoint, we're reaping the benefits today, right? So Leonard Arrington's church historian, in the book comes out 1976. It's called Story of the Latter-day Saints. Now, if you were to read Story of the Latter-day Saints today, it's nowhere near as progressive as Rough Stone Rolling or some other volumes. So sometimes when people read it, they're like, what was the big deal? We have way harder core stuff today. But for its time, it was there were many aspects of it that were a direct challenge to the traditional narrative. It gets published it didn't go through correlation or anything. It just gets published, but the name of the church is right on it. President Benson, secretary, some other members of the Quorum of the 12, they get copies, and they raise a big firestorm controversy. They're like, stop, put on the brakes. What on earth just came out from the history department? And so they have this, they have all these meetings, and President Kimball is there, and we talk about this in the book because it's recorded in the diaries. We don't have President Benson's perspective. I'd love one day, if his diaries are ever released, to see if he wrote about this, because we were just getting this from Leonard Arrington's perspective. But there's enough there where you can see there's this. They sit down, and President Benson's like, these are the concerns I have with the book. Some of the concerns were the portrayal of Joseph Smith. Yes. The Story of Latter-day Saints, they had concerns with the story of the seagulls, that they said were kind of demeaning that was a miracle from God, which actually is a whole controversy actually right now. Even when my dad went to BYU, and when he was in his Utah history class, they were like, yeah, the idea of the seagulls were sent by God and it was this big miracle, debunked historically. So we actually go into the whole seagulls. We call it the seagulls cover up. That no, there are sources to show it was a miracle. The progressive narrative trying to twist that story is not true.
Man, even attacking the seagull.
Right.
Oh, these people are shameless.
Yeah,
Well,
I
no,
mean,
look,
what's
they're
wrong
like,
with
it's
the
folklore.
pioneers going, hey, this is God's send. Look, the seagulls are eating the locusts. They're recognizing what we call today tender mercies of the Lord.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it doesn't have to be like a supernatural event.
Right.
It's something that
Exactly.
happened where it's like, whoo, okay, glad that happened, and that's it. It's still a miracle. It doesn't have to be like some big thing. I don't know. I don't even know the details of that argument, but I'm assuming that
he basically
that might be part of
mocks it. He
Yes.
mocks the whole seagull thing.
They tried to say that none of the pioneers recognized it as a miracle at the time. It was something that decades later kind of turned into this folklore, and that we can actually explain it scientifically. So it wasn't actually a miracle. We can actually explain what happened. It wasn't a phenomenon. It wasn't an unusual thing. And anyway, so we go into debunking all of that, which comes to a very important part of this whole story. So during this time, Leonard Arrington actually has a conversation with a general authority, where this guy comes to him and says, you're basically, yes, you are changing the history. Leonard Arrington wasn't a big fan of Joseph Fielding Smith's work. So Joseph Fielding Smith was kind of the historian that preceded Leonard Arrington. He's the one that wrote Essentials in Church History, and He was a masterful historian. I will go on the
Joseph
record
Fielding
saying that.
Smith?
I will take a ton of heat for saying that.
Joseph Fielding Smith?
Yes.
He was a young earther too, like me.
Yes.
I'm a young earther.
Now
I'm
you're
sorry.
definitely going to get censored on Reddit.
No, 6,000 years. That's it. We're
Right.
going into the millennium, which is the Sabbath of this earth's temporal existence. Duh.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, now we know just how fringe you guys really are. But
Well, I don't have an opinion
goes,
about that.
"I didn't say that,
I'm good
but
either
you're-"
way. I don't really have a strong. Like with a lot of these things, whether it's young earther or heartland versus Mesa, like I really don't have very strong opinions when
I
it
don't
comes
have
to that.
opinions
Like
on the Heartland thing either. I think
I
Hannah's
think
a
it's good. I
Heartlander.
mean, obviously one or the other happened, and whenever that actually comes out, okay, whatever. Like, okay, I've sorry, I don't mean to go off on this tangent. If I had to pick, for example, with the Heartland or the Mesoamerica, I'd probably go with the Heartland because, like, I went to a symposium one time with Rod Meldrum. My dad took me there, and it made a lot of sense. But like, it's just like one of those things I don't care that much about. And when it's revealed, okay, so the Earth is million years old. Okay, yeah, it's 6,000 years old. Okay,
yes. Right. I think the key is because I feel the same way, and I believe Lehi's descendants spread all over. So I believe all the temple dedications down in Chile and Brazil and different Guatemala, I believe they're all legit, right? It's just going to, okay, what did Joseph Smith actually say about where the Book of Mormon occurred? Do we believe him? And then the second thing is just, where is the covenant on the land? And what implications does that have? That's the only thing that matters, right? Is
yeah.
Where's the covenant? Where are all these prophecies? Where are we supposed to build Zion? Otherwise, well, I agree 100%. Like, who really cares? And then I'd just say, on the whole, Joseph Fielding Smith and the Darwinian Evolution, Age of the Earth, I think he does a pretty good job in Man, His Origin and Destiny, and some other books, just explaining what the doctrinal implications are of the history. But I understand exactly where you're coming from, like where you're like, okay, when we're trying to look at our battles, you're like, what matters and what doesn't. But Leonard Arrington has this conversation with this general authority, and they're talking about Joseph Fielding Smith's history. And Leonard Arrington says something very interesting. He says, there isn't a huge difference between the history and my history versus Joseph Fielding Smith's. The difference is how we see God being involved versus whether we attribute things to more natural causes. That is huge, because the way that too often progressivism tries to sell their history is they're like, well, we aren't, we have all this new history that was never told before, and we have this and that, and the past traditionalist history was all a lie, and it's key to come down to, when you actually look at it, Joseph Fielding Smith talked about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Joseph Fielding Smith debated plural marriage publicly. It wasn't like there was a big cover up, and he never like, oh, let's not tell anyone that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy, right? And now here's progressive historians like, we're going to tell the truth, right? And because you've been lied to. The key comes down to how we're interpreting the history. So when Leonard Arrington looks at the Great Depression, he's going to say, well, that was a purely economical event. FDR was a huge savior, and his policies. He was a big fan of FDR. Leonard Arrington was. Whereas Joseph Fielding Smith, when he writes about the Great Depression, he says, this was a consequence of America forsaking God. We were not keeping the Sabbath day holy. We were not keeping the commandments, and God gave judgment on this nation. Now, people are going to pick. So that's where every person gets to decide. Do I lean more towards the progressive interpretation or more towards the traditionalist? How do we see God involved in history? Is God involved in history? And that's why I believe the Book of Mormon is actually a key prototype of what good history is. Is it a polemic? That's another big debate. Is Leonard Arrington's debating in the Story of the Latter-day Saints, where he's like, well, I'm not writing history to defend the church. We just got to write it more objective, like alleged revelations. And Joseph Smith said he had the first vision, right? Well, if you look at the Book of Mormon, how did Mormon, one of the greatest historians to live, how did he write the Book of Mormon? How does he pull lessons and draw history? The Book of Mormon is his history textbook. Anyway, so all these debates are happening with the Story of the Latter-day Saints. general authorities are trying to, they're debating on it in these meetings. President Benson succeeds in having the second printing stopped for a period of time. It wasn't republished till years later. But during this time, they come to, here's the story that Troy was asking for. So Leonard Arrington, they say, how did this, like, time out? We're having all of this conversation, but the book's already out. How did this book get through? Who was supposed to be reviewing this manuscript before it was just published with the church's name on it? And Leonard Arrington brings a diary entry to them, and then he says, well, it wasn't President Kimball, it was the president of the church before him, Harold B. Lee. We had this conversation, and he basically gave me the go-ahead that I didn't need to get any of my books reviewed and before publishing them. I mean, I'm giving you an overview here. All the details are in the book. The problem with that diary entry is the entry that he submitted to the church and said, here's my diary entry as evidence kind of that this conversation did take place, was changed from his real diary entry in his journal, because today we have Leonard Arrington's, we have his original diary entry and we have the diary entry he submitted to the church, and they're different. He added information into the one. So he sent it to the church and he said, this was in my diary, and it wasn't really in his diary. So, which obviously raises some questions about integrity and some other conversation, but it just shows
let's just
you
say he
the
wasn't
depth.
honest, right?
Yeah, it just shows you the depth of this battle that was going on. Again, like Leonard Arrington said, trying to push through bureaucracy, and because he felt like driven, like, I've got to do this. This will save the church. This is what God wants me to do. So I've got to push forward, no matter who stands in my way, whether it's President Benson or others. The church of the future will be grateful. So we push forward.
Yeah, originally in the diary, it says he began talking about the problem of having committees read books by church authorities. And then he deletes, I thought it a good omen. Well, he crosses out, right?
Yes. So he removed some things and then added other stuff.
Yeah. Well, you could, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but it's like, you guys can't see that, can you?
Not very well.
Yeah.
Well, there's the original entry and there's the
Very small compared to, yes.
the new one.
Right.
And, but if you get the book, you can read it.
Yes. Yes. So like you're saying, this battle continues on, more friction. There's a student's thesis paper that comes out that kind of outs a bunch of the historians bashing President Benson and kind of revealing this is the direction we're trying to move the church. That didn't look too well. And then the 1984 sesquicentennial history, well, it was before 1984. The goal was to publish it in 1980, but and Richard Bushman was a big part of that controversy. Anyways, it finally came to the point to where Leonard Arrington was removed from his position as church historian, and he and his staff were moved to BYU. They call it their exile, and they actually call it the fall of Camelot, because they say, oh, we had this Camelot beautiful era, and then we basically got kicked out and exiled. And at first, Leonard Arrington was really discouraged, and then he realized, wait a minute, I just got moved from publishing books for the whole church to a position of influence where now I can mentor and train and shape all of the minds and hearts of the Latter-day Saint youth that will then be writing our history. Gold. And so they go to work, and that brings us to where we are today. So a lot of people are like, we've never even heard of this Leonard Arrington, but once you actually start doing the tree, you realize, well, like Richard Bushman's connected, and so historian is connected, and it all goes back to Leonard Arrington in this movement.
So I've got about 5 minutes. This has been awesome. This is huge. And we've only discussed a couple chapters, brothers and sisters. This is, you got to get the book. I'm not pushing the book. Hannah doesn't care either way.
I'm pushing the book for, I'm going to put, you guys, everyone watching my channel, there's a YouTube channel. I'm sure most of you are already familiar with Joseph Smith Foundation, but there's a YouTube channel, and there's also the website. So I'm going to be putting the links for those in the description below. So make sure to check it out. Buy a book.
Yeah, me as well. I'm going to put the links as well.
And you can buy the books directly from your website.
Yes, and they're on Amazon and other bookstores
Okay.
online.
Yeah. You just go to Joseph Smith Foundation and then
Mhm.
type, or you can find it right there. I think it's on the homepage, right?
Yes.
If you scroll down.
Yeah.
So real quick, so Leonard Arrington, he didn't even believe in the authenticity or the need for an atonement, right? Didn't you discuss that too?
That was his friend. I don't have a
Oh,
specific quote on that. I mean, obviously his view of the atonement is going to be very different from a Joseph Fielding Smith or
okay.
from mine. But
Well,
yes.
so I want to leave with this right here. What, or did you have anything too, Jared?
No, that's probably good for now.
Okay. So what, here's what I wanted to ask you, and it's paramount. Oh goodness, how do I say this? Okay, so he goes to BYU. Oh, why do you think the brethren sent him to BYU? And I know you said before that you agreed with who was asked if he was going to be excommunicated or if there was going to be any church discipline, and they said no. I'm not.
Yes,
I don't think that would
that
be
was
a good
his
idea.
friend who started.
Why
the
do you
Smart
think
Elders,
they
but
sent
yeah.
him to BYU, knowing that he could? Is it because we need this? You can't just smother this forever. You got to let it, the smoke come out. You know, I don't know. What do
To
you
be
think?
honest, I have absolutely no idea because I have none of the minutes or any personal knowledge of the conversations or who made the
Okay.
decisions and stuff like that. But you bring up a good point that is a good point to close out on. A lot of times when people face opposing viewpoints, whether you're on the right or whether you're on the left, whether you're moderate, whether you're traditionalist, progressive, we have this very quick attitude of smash the other side, silence, and things like that. And I think what you were kind of hinting at there is we don't need to be afraid of hearing other people's viewpoints. We don't need to be afraid. We don't need to censor, but we do need to have open dialogue and the truth will always come out. With that, I believe it's more important than ever for every Latter-day Saint today to become aware what they believe and really know, because for too long, it's like Heber C. Kimball's quote where he said, a test is coming, right? He says, if you do not have a witness of the truth of the gospel for yourself, you will fall when this test comes. And so it comes down to every single one of us. We need to know, do we know who Joseph Smith was for himself, for ourselves? Do we have a testimony of the Book of Mormon? Do we understand the doctrine? We need to get into the scriptures. We need to ask ourselves if we really know them, and do we really know Jesus Christ? Everyone's using the phrase a lot, right? Hear him, but can you actually recognize who is speaking? Is it the Lord or is it a counterfeit? Can you recognize the voice of the true shepherd? And for, I'll close with this. I can bear my testimony that I know without a shadow of a doubt that not only was Joseph Smith a true prophet, but that the revelations that he gave and the teachings that he gave were the word of the Lord, and that they were the solutions, the doctrine that we need to move forward. There's so much heartache, there is so much pain. If we will put our trust back in that foundation, if we build on that foundation, our homes will not fall. And, you know, a lot of people will say, oh no, here she goes into bearing her testimony. Like, what's up with, right? Like, we knew this was all just emotion based. But, you know, when Jesus Christ came to the Jews, they had gone into their own mode of denying revelation and denying that you could receive a sure witness. And we know that because when Jesus Christ appears on the scenes, he begins bearing, the Pharisees are saying, who is this guy? He speaks with authority. Like, who is he to come around and say, I know this, right? And Jesus Christ says, we speak that we do know of things that we have seen. And we need, every single one of us needs to come to the point where we can say that we know, that we have seen. That's how Jacob was able to have his big debate with Sharon. And he couldn't be moved because he said, I have talked with angels. I have talked with the Lord. I know this. And it requires a sacrifice. I do not have the testimony that I have today because it came naturally. I had to sacrifice. I had to fast and pray. I had to pay a price. But I could just encourage every person, it is worth the sacrifice to gain that testimony, because once you discover that hope, it changes everything in your life. And so I just want to encourage every person listening to this, take the time, get on your knees, study, become acquainted with the facts. Don't be afraid of opposing viewpoints. Check it out, do the research, get on your knees, get an answer, because it will take you on a journey that you will never regret.
Thank you so much,
Agreed.
Hannah. And you're a Smith too, right? You are.
I'm a descendant of Joseph Smith's cousin, Silas.
Wow.
So
That's really
You're still
cool.
a Smith.
so it's in the blood. Sorry.
I want to have you on another time. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
We can talk about some other things.
Mhm.
I don't like Jared said, some of the stuff you talk, like you actually have Rod Meldrum on sometimes, right? Meldrum?
Yes, we're friends. I do know
Okay.
Rod. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll talk about other things. And then
Can
we'll
I
leave
be
the
there
link.
too?
What's that?
Can I be there too?
Yes, of course.
No, definitely
Jared.
not you. You caused a lot of
I
trouble.
was going to get to you too, Jared. Thank you so much for being here. And this is going to be on, this is Jared's video too. He's going to share it on his channel and I'll share it. And then we're going to leave the link. You guys can get all 3 books for a very good price, or you could just get the Faith Crisis 2 that we talked about today.
There's Kindles, audiobooks coming out. So there's a lot of different options.
Go to the website. We'll leave the link. The Joseph Smith Foundation. Thank you so much, Hannah. And thank you for bearing your testimony. Thank you, Jared, with Christian Homestead. All right. Don't go away. Hold on a second.